Some gifts should not be unwrapped, some secrets should not be held, and some truths, once hidden, refuse to remain quiet, scratching their way back to the light with a soft, steady force that changes history itself. December 1873. The air was thick and wet over the Mississippi River Delta, a blanket of fog holding tight to the old cypress trees and twisting waterways. In the rich plantation areas, where the wounds of war were still raw, but the appearance of greatness continued, a deal took place. It was a deal talked about in quiet voices, a dark reminder of a past that many said was finished, yet still hung on the land like Spanish moss. Two girls, twins not quite 14 years old, their names and stories carefully wiped away, were bought at a secret sale. They were not headed for work in the fields, nor for house duties in the big home. No, their destiny was much darker, wrapped in red velvet and given as Christmas morning presents for the Baron's two wasteful sons. What came next was not a story of ghosts or a big uprising. It was a tale woven from careful watching, fearless bravery, and an almost impossible act of resistance. What these two girls did in the spring of 1874 would not only destroy 3 families, but it would also reveal a scheme of silence so deeply buried that it had become the very foundation of the community. It would make an entire county burn its papers, move its courthouse, and together pretend a whole winter never existed. The Baron who purchased them was never seen again, his legacy melting into rumor and guessing. His sons were discovered, yes, but what had been done to them, not in body, but to their very souls, was something no one could understand, something that challenged the rough justice of that time. And the twins, they disappeared, not into nothing, but into a system so large, so carefully concealed that even today, historians won't talk about it publicly, afraid of what its true size means. Before we go deeper into the disturbing account of the Baron and the twin girls who permanently changed the direction of St. Helena Parish, I ask you to think about the importance of forgotten histories. If you are pulled to the darkest parts of American history, the stories they purposely leave out of textbooks, the events they desperately tried to remove, then I ask you to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell and tell me in the comments below what state you're listening from. Because this story, though based in the Louisiana Delta, reaches more places, more lives than you might ever think. Now let us travel back to a time when the law was a flexible idea, when power was counted not just in fields of land, but in the lives that worked upon it. And when 2 children, innocent and unaware, were wrapped like dolls, headed for a fate that would either destroy them or shape them into something unbreakable. The parish of St. Helena, Louisiana, in the winter of 1873, was a place stuck in a constant twilight, caught carefully between the harsh realities of a war just ended and the unsure dawn of a new reluctantly accepted freedom. 8 years had gone by since the guns fell quiet, since the Emancipation Proclamation had theoretically broken the chains of slavery. Yet, Reconstruction rather than healing had only made the rotting wounds of the South worse, turning old wrongs into new harmful forms. The grand plantations, monuments to a past time of cotton kings and human property, still stood. Their white columns, often cracked and flaking, shined stubbornly in the weak winter sun, throwing long skeleton shadows across fields that reached to the horizon. But the work that kept them going had changed, at least on paper. The fields were now worked by men and women who were legally free, yes, but practically trapped by a system of debt and fear. Sharecropping had replaced the auction block, but the chains were simply made of invisible contracts, huge interest rates, and the steady threat of removal rather than cold, hard iron. The appearance of freedom was a cruel trick shimmering just out of reach. Greensburg, the parish center, was a small, dusty town, its population hardly 800 people, yet it was the nerve center of St. Helena. It housed the courthouse, a low brick building with a constantly leaking roof, the land office, where every deed and mortgage was carefully recorded, and the only bank for 30 miles. Its vault, a quiet reminder of the wealth gathered in a few powerful hands. Greensburg was a town built on paper, on records, deeds, contracts, mortgages, titles, and the occasional bill of sale for animals or equipment. Everything was written down, everything was filed. And in 1873, those records were more valuable than gold, for they decided who owned what, and more importantly, who owned whom, even if the language had shifted from slave to debtor or tenant. The power of the written word, even when twisted, was total. At the very top, this fragile, simmering world, sat a man, the locals, with a mixture of respect and dislike, simply called the Baron. His real name was Lucien Deveau, though no one dared say it in his presence without the title. He was not nobility by blood, not by any European standard, but he carried himself with an air of inherited superiority, as if the very land bent to his command, tall with a shock of silver hair that seemed to catch the light even in dark rooms, and a voice like far-away thunder rolling across the delta. Deveau was a force of nature. He owned 4,000 acres of prime delta land, rich and fertile, and controlled the labor of over 200 people. Technically, they were sharecroppers. Technically, they were free. But Deveau held their debts, their contracts, their very livelihoods, and the futures of their children in a thick, leather-bound ledger he kept locked in his study. A ledger more powerful than any law. His word was law, his ledger, scripture. He had 2 sons, heirs to his name and his rule, but not to his cleverness or his strong will. The older Henri was 22, a man already emptied out by laziness and an inherited cruelty. He had his father's tall height, but none of his calculated presence. Henri spent his days riding the property line on a magnificent black horse, a rifle across his back, enforcing boundaries no one dared cross. He had built a reputation for meanness, a cold, quiet evil that didn't need to raise its voice to create terror. Workers who upset him found their portions mysteriously reduced. Their cabins searched without warning. Their children suddenly moved to the farthest, most back-breaking fields. His cruelty was a slow, careful burn, designed to break spirits rather than bodies. The younger son, Julien, was 19, and if possible, even worse, where Henri was cold and calculating, Julien was explosive, a live wire of unpredictable rage and self-pleasure. He drank too much cheap whiskey, gambled away amounts his father quietly covered, and took far too much pleasure in watching things break, be it a glass, a spirit, or a bone. He had been kicked out from 2 different schools in New Orleans, returning home each time with growing debts his father grudgingly paid, and a temper his father, for reasons no one understood, quietly ignored. Julien collected things, an array of shining guns, wickedly sharp knives, and exotic birds he kept in fancy cages until neglected and starved. They died. He was constantly bored, and boredom in a young man with unchecked power and a cruel streak was a truly dangerous thing. A spark waiting for fuel. Lucien Deveau loved his sons not for who they were, but for what they represented. The continuation of his name, the carrying on of his empire. He loved them as a king loves his heirs, as extensions of his own power. And in December of 1873, as the festive season approached, he decided to give them a gift that would tie them to him forever. A gift that would teach them the ultimate, brutal lesson of power. That some people are not people at all, but things, and things, no matter their form, can be owned, controlled, and thrown away at will. The Devo estate, known simply as the Baron's Place by the locals, sat at the end of a long winding oak-lined drive that seemed to go on forever, a tree tunnel leading to a forgotten past. The house itself was a sprawling 3-story monument to a world that, despite all evidence, Lucien refused to believe no longer existed. White, painted brick, its front imposing and severe, with tall, narrow windows that seemed to stare out blankly, and wide porches that wrapped around the entire structure, offering shade in summer and a freezing exposure in winter. Inside the rooms were vast and hollow, filled with heavy, dark furniture shipped from France, portraits of ancestors who were not truly ancestors, but rather carefully chosen figures from European nobility, and a silence so deep, so thick, it felt like a held breath, waiting for something to break it. In the quarters behind the main house, a community of 200 souls lived in cabins that had not seen repairs since before the war. These were not the pretty whitewashed cottages of romanticized memory, but rough-hewn shacks, their roofs patched with tin, their walls filled with mud, their floors bare earth. They worked the fields from the first light of dawn until the last bit of light faded from the sky. Their bodies hurting, their spirits tired. At night they gathered in low voices, sharing what little they had, small portions of food, whispered stories of strength, and urgent warnings passed from one generation to the next. They knew the Devo family. They knew the casual cruelty of Henri, the explosive temper of Julien, and they knew what happened to those who upset them. In December of 1873, a new kind of worry settled over the quarters, a feeling that something was coming. Because the Baron had been making trips. 3 times in November, Lucien Devo had taken the steamboat downriver to New Orleans, staying 2 or 3 days each time. He told no one where he went or what he did. His movements company varied in his usual impossible secrecy. But when he returned, he carried himself differently, not with tiredness, but with a subtle shift in his manner, like a man who had made a huge decision and was deeply pleased with what it meant. His sons noticed, exchanging worried glances. The workers noticed their eyes following his movements with a quiet group worry. And in a place like St. Helena Parish, where every gesture, every detail, every secret trip held deep meaning. That kind of secrecy meant something bad was brewing. On December 18, 1873, Lucien Devo made his final bold trip to New Orleans. He returned on December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, the air thick with waiting and a biting chill. And he was not alone. The steamboat Crescent Belle, a paddle-wheeler whose fancy metalwork hid its cargo of human and material goods, docked at the Greensburg landing just after sunset on December 23rd. The air was cold and damp, the kind of spreading chill that went into one's bones and settled there, refusing to be moved. A thin, ghostly mist rose from the dark, swirling waters of the river, curling around the moss-covered supports, and drifting like a phantom across the rough-hewn wooden planks of the dock. The few men unloading cargo, their breath forming clouds in the cold air, worked with a frantic speed, eager to finish their difficult tasks and retreat to the small warmth of their homes and fires. Lucien Devo walked down the gangplank alone, a solitary, imposing figure. He carried a worn leather bag clutched in one hand, and his long black wool coat, tailored to perfection, seemed to absorb the fading light, making him appear less a man and more a moving shadow against the light. He offered a brief nod to the dock workers, his gaze sweeping over them with an almost invisible disdain. But he did not speak. His silence was a command, a barrier. Behind him, coming out from the dimly lit passenger cabin, two figures appeared, hesitant and small, against the vastness of the river and the approaching night. They were girls, twins, identical in every visible way, their features mirroring each other with an unsettling accuracy. They wore plain gray dresses, thin and worn, totally inadequate for the biting cold that filled the air. Their heads were covered with dark coarse shawls pulled low and tight, effectively hiding their faces, making them anonymous. They carried nothing, no bags, no bundles, no small treasured belongings. Nothing to suggest they had come from anywhere specific or were headed for any particular place. They moved in perfect, almost matched rhythm, stepping off the boat together, stopping together, waiting together like two halves of a single quiet being. One of the dock workers, a man named Tobias Holt, a weathered veteran of the riverfront, later told his wife Martha that the girls never once looked up. Their eyes remained fixed on the ground, their gazes turned away, as if the very act of looking might bring further trouble. And when the Baron, with a dismissive flick of his wrist, motioned for them to follow, they did so without a moment's pause, without a single question, like shadows obediently following a body. Tobias, a man who had seen countless arrivals and departures, felt a tingle of worry. There was something deeply unsettling about their complete stillness, their total lack of protest. Devo led them to a covered wagon, its canvas top stained and weathered, which stood waiting at the end of the dock. The driver, a man named Cato, a quiet and silent individual who had worked the Devo stables for decades, climbed down from the driver's seat, his face marked with years of sun and work, showed no emotion as he opened the back flap of the wagon. The Baron motioned again, a silent command, and the twins, without a word, climbed inside, disappearing into the dark interior. Cato, his movements practiced and quick, closed the canvas flap, securing it tightly. With a creak of wheels and a soft thud of hooves on the muddy road, the wagon rolled away, swallowed by the gathering darkness and the swirling river mist. No one asked questions. No one ever did. Not when it concerned the Baron. To question was to invite trouble, and trouble in St. Helena Parish often arrived with a swift, brutal ending. But Tobias Holt, who had seen many things in his 43 years, the rise and fall of river fortunes, the quiet desperation of the newly free, the casual cruelty of the powerful, said later that he felt something deep that night, a coldness that had nothing to do with the biting weather, a sense that something deeply wrong, something deeply unnatural, had just arrived in St. Helena Parish, and that it would not leave quietly. It was a feeling, a shiver down his spine that stayed long after the wagon's rumbling faded into the night. The wagon took the river road, a narrow, winding track that followed the Snake, like path of the Mississippi, back to the Devo estate. The journey, nearly an hour long, was difficult. The road was deeply rutted and uneven, proof of years of neglect and heavy rains, and the wagon's wheels groaned and creaked with every bump and turn, a sad cry against the silence of the night. Inside the wagon, covered in darkness, the twins sat in perfect silence. Cato, who drove with his back to them, his senses tuned to the road and the horses, later swore that he never heard them speak. Not once, not a whisper, not a sigh, not even the subtle shift of breathing. It was as if they had stopped existing, becoming mere cargo, silent and still. When the wagon finally rolled through the imposing iron gates of the Devo estate, it was nearly 8. The house, alight in the surrounding darkness, was lit from within. every window glowing with the warm, welcoming lamplight that hid the coldness within its walls. Henri and Julien, their figures outlined against the bright interior, were waiting on the front porch, smoking cigars, their faces lit by the flickering embers, their eyes fixed on the long, dark drive. When they saw the wagon emerge from the gloom, they straightened, flicked their cigars into the damp dirt, and walked down the wide stone steps, their footsteps echoing faintly. Lucien Deveau climbed down from the wagon, a proud smile playing on his lips, a rare display of genuine satisfaction. He looked at his sons, his gaze sweeping over them with owning pride. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice warm and deep, filled with a chilling pleasure, "your Christmas gifts have arrived." Henri's brow wrinkled almost invisibly, a flicker of something like worry crossing his usually blank face. Julien, however, grinned, a wide, hunting smile that revealed too much. Cato, ever quick, opened the back of the wagon, and the twins, moving with their usual, unsettling unity, climbed out. For the first time, bathed in the bright, harsh light spilling from the house, the Deveau sons could see them clearly. They were clearly young, 14, perhaps 15 years old, their bodies still thin, not yet fully formed. Their skin was a warm, light brown, their hair dark and braided tightly against their scalps, carefully neat. Their faces, now fully visible, were indeed identical. High, delicate cheekbones, full, unsmiling lips, and dark, bottomless eyes that reflected the lamplight like polished stone, revealing nothing of the thoughts or feelings that lay beneath. They had a striking, almost heavenly beauty, the kind that made men uncomfortable, exactly because they were still children, and beauty in children, especially those in such a vulnerable state, was a dangerous, often tragic thing. Julien, ever the more rash and openly cruel, stepped forward, circling them slowly, his gaze lingering, inspecting them with the detached examination one might apply to a prize horse or a newly bought hunting dog. Henri remained where he was, his expression unreadable, a mask of cold indifference. "Where did you find them, father?" Julien asked, his voice laced with an owning curiosity. "New Orleans," Lucien replied, his tone smug. "A private sale, very private. They have no papers, no family, no history. As far as the world is concerned, they do not exist. They are ghosts waiting to be given form by our will." Henri's frown deepened, a subtle crease between his brows. "Father, the law," he began, a hint of caution in his voice. Even Henri, with all his cruelty, understood the shifting sands of the post-war legal landscape. "The law," Lucien interrupted, his voice cutting, dismissive, "is what I say it is, Henri, and I say these girls are property. My property, and now by extension yours, a gift, a lesson, a tool." He motioned to the twins, a sweeping owning motion. "They will serve you, they will obey you, they will do whatever you ask without question, without complaint. Consider them an education in power, gentlemen, because power is not merely what you inherit. It is what you take, it is what you assert, it is what you command." Julien laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that grated on the ears, empty of genuine joy. Henri, as was his habit, said nothing, his silence more chilling than his brother's laughter. The twins stood perfectly still, their eyes still fixed on the ground, their hands folded neatly in front of them, a picture of passive obedience. They did not react to Lucien's words, did not flinch, did not even seem to breathe. They simply waited, two quiet statues in the harsh lamplight. Lucien Deveau clapped his hands once, a sharp final crack that echoed in the cold night air. "Take them inside," he commanded Cato, his voice now quick and businesslike. "Put them in the east wing, the small room at the end of the hall. Lock the door and ensure they are fed sparingly." Cato nodded, his face still blank, and motioned for the twins to follow. They did, moving with that same eerie rhythm, their footsteps silent on the wooden steps of the porch, then fading into the echoing silence of the house. As they disappeared into the hollow interior, Lucien turned back to his sons, a victorious glint in his eyes. "Merry Christmas, gentlemen," he said, his voice a low purr of satisfaction. "Use them wisely, and remember, they are proof of our lasting will." And then he went inside, leaving Henri and Julien standing in the biting cold, staring at the door through which the twins had vanished, the meaning of their father's gift slowly settling upon them. That night, no one in the quarters slept well. The workers, huddled in their unheated cabins, whispered to each other in the dark, passing along what little they knew, what little they had seen, that the Baron had brought something back from New Orleans, something locked away in the East Wing, something that was a gift for his sons. The air was thick with unspoken fears, with the chilling understanding that the old ways, though legally ended, were far from dead. And in the main house, in the small cold room at the very end of the East Wing, the twins sat on the bare floor in the total darkness, holding each other's hands, their bodies pressed together for warmth and comfort, and waited for Christmas morning, for whatever new horror it might bring. Their silence was not giving in, but a deep, watchful stillness, a quiet study of their new prison. Christmas Day 1873 began not with the festive cheer of songs and bright lights, but with a cold, heavy grayness. The sky was the color of old iron, heavy and firm, pressing down on the delta. A light, steady rain began to fall just after sunrise, a soft, rhythmic tapping against the tall, narrow windows of the Devo house, like the constant drumming of fingernails on glass. A sad accompaniment to the day. Inside, the Devo family gathered in the main parlor, a vast, dimly lit room ruled by a massive fireplace that offered little warmth. Lucien Devo sat at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, dressed in a dark, perfectly tailored suit. His silver hair combed back with careful accuracy, his expression calm, almost blessed, as if he had just performed a great act of kindness. Henri and Julien sat on either side of him, both unusually quiet, their usual loudness subdued by their father's imposing presence and the unspoken weight of the previous night's arrival. The table was set with the finest imported china, delicate porcelain decorated with complex patterns, and gleaming crystal goblets that caught the small light. The breakfast, a fancy spread of smoked ham, fluffy biscuits, homemade preserves, and steaming coffee, was served by two women from the quarters, their faces blank, their movements swift and practiced, their eyes carefully kept downcast, avoiding any direct contact. No one mentioned the twins. Their presence, though felt, was a silent, uncomfortable truth. An elephant in the fancy room. After breakfast, Lucien rose from the table, a subtle motion of his hand commanding his sons to follow. They walked through the hollow house in silence, their footsteps echoing on the polished wood floors, the sound amplified in the stillness, until they reached the East Wing, a less often used section of the house, colder and more sparsely furnished. Lucien produced a small fancy key from his waistcoat pocket, its brass shining dully, and with a soft click unlocked the heavy wooden door at the very end of the hall. The room was small, barely larger than a closet, and sparsely furnished, a narrow, uncomfortable-looking bed with a thin mattress, a single, wobbly wooden chair, and a washstand with a chipped porcelain basin. The air was stale, tinged with a scent of dust and holding. The twins were sitting on the bare floor where they had been left the night before, their bodies pressed together, still holding hands, still totally silent. They looked up when the door opened, their dark eyes meeting Lucien's gaze for a quick moment, but their expressions did not change, remaining as unreadable as polished stone. Lucien stepped aside, a theatrical movement, and motioned for his sons to enter the small, cramped space. "They are yours now," he said simply, his voice empty of emotion as if discussing a new piece of farm equipment. "Do with them as you please. They are yours to command." And then he left, closing the door behind him with a soft final thud, leaving his sons alone with their gifts. What happened in that small, cold room over the next 3 months is not entirely known, not in its full, brutal detail. The twins, Cora and Clara, never spoke of it in later years, their silence a proof of the unspeakable, and the Devots' sons, Henri and Julien, never offered any explanation, their memories conveniently selective. But there are fragments, whispers, pieces of testimony gathered later from the workers in the quarters, individuals who saw things, heard things, noticed things in the edge of their own difficult lives. These fragments pieced together paint a chilling, suggested picture. A woman named Delphine, who worked in the main house as a cook, her hands always stained with flour and grease, said that the twins were brought down to the kitchen every morning for a single small meal. A crust of stale bread, a cup of water, sometimes, if they were lucky, a piece of bruised fruit. They ate quickly, their movements precise and economical in silence, their eyes never meeting hers. As they finished, they were taken back upstairs, their presence a quick, unsettling shadow. Delphine swore they never looked at anyone, never asked for anything, never made a sound. Their silence was complete unnerving. A man named Ezra, who tended the stables, his hands twisted from years of handling horses and heavy equipment, said that he saw Julien Devo leading the twins out to the old carriage house one afternoon in late January. The air was crisp, the ground still hard with frost. He remembered Julien's laughter, a harsh, jarring sound that carried on the wind, and the twins' total lack of response. Ezra said he heard sounds coming from the carriage house, sharp, splitting sounds like wood breaking or something being struck. But he did not look. No one looked. To look was to invite the Baron's anger, and that was a price no one was willing to pay. He simply turned his back, pretending not to hear, not to see, a young girl named Bess, barely 12 years old, who worked in the laundry, her small hands always chapped from harsh soap and cold water, said that she saw the twins once through a window. It was a rare moment of stillness in her day. She said they were standing in their small room facing each other, their hands held together and their lips were moving, a silent, rhythmic motion. She said it looked like they were praying, a desperate, unheard plea, but she could not make out the words. Their faces, even from a distance, seemed marked with an ancient sorrow. And a man named Samuel, who drove the Devo carriage, a sturdy, reliable man who had served the family for decades, said that in early March he was ordered to take Henri and the twins into Greensburg. The spring air was beginning to soften, carrying the scent of damp earth and budding magnolia. He remembered Henri sitting in the carriage with them, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed straight ahead, while the twins sat perfectly still, their hands folded in their laps, their eyes downcast as if carved from wood. Samuel said that when they reached the town, Henri took them into the courthouse, the very same courthouse where land deeds and contracts were filed, where the fate of so many was decided on paper, and they were inside for nearly an hour. When they came out, Henri was smiling, a thin, satisfied curl of his lips, and the twins, as always, were not. Their faces remained blank, unreadable. Samuel, a man of quiet watching, said he asked Henri what they had done in the courthouse, a rare moment of curiosity beating his usual care. Henri, with a dismissive wave of his hand, told him to mind his own business, his tone sharp and warning. But Samuel noticed something. When the twins climbed back into the carriage, one of them, he could not tell which, for their likeness was uncanny, was holding a piece of paper. It was folded small, tucked carefully into the sleeve of her plain gray dress, almost invisible, but he saw it. Just for a quick moment, a flash of white against the drab fabric. He never saw it again. The paper, like so many other things in their lives, vanished into the shadows. By mid-March, the workers in the quarters were whispering about the twins. Not because of what they had seen, for they had seen little, but because of what they had not seen. The twins had been at the Devo estate for 3 long silent months, and in all that time no one had heard them speak, not a single word. Not a cry of pain, not a sigh of despair, not even the softest sound of human speech. Their silence was a deep, unsettling mystery. Some said they were mute, born without the gift of speech. Some said they were broken, their spirits crushed beyond repair. Some, the more superstitious among them, whispered that they were something else entirely, something unnatural, something touched by the spirits of the bayou. And then on the night of March 19th, 1874, as the first fireflies began to dance in the humid air, everything changed. The long silent watch was about to break. The twins, Cora and Clara, had not been idle in their holding. Their silence was not a sign of giving in, but a shield, a carefully built front behind which their minds, sharp and tough, worked with a quiet, desperate intensity. Their mother, back in Virginia before the fire, had been a seamstress, but she had also had a fierce love for learning. She had taught her daughters to read and write, skills considered dangerous for their position, but skills that would ultimately become their salvation. She had taught them to figure out the complex loops and curves of the written word, to unlock the secrets held within pages. In the Devo house, a place where books were more often decorative than read, they had found a hidden treasure. In the dusty, forgotten corners of the East Wing, in a small, unused library that smelled of mildew and neglect, they discovered old books, volumes of law, forgotten histories, even a few tattered novels. No one thought to lock them away, for who among the help would dare touch such things? And who among the Devo family would even notice? Late at night, long after the who, Say had fallen silent. After the last lamp had been put out, Cora and Clara would slip from their room. They moved like ghosts, their bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. By the faint flickering light of a stolen candle stub, or sometimes by the pale glow of the moon filtering through a grimy window, they would read. They devoured the words, absorbing them, understanding them. They learned about the law, about contracts, about property and ownership, and most importantly, about the chaotic, often contradictory legal landscape of Reconstruction. They learned that even in a system designed to oppress, there were loopholes, cracks in the front if one knew where to look. They learned about the courthouse in Greensburg, about the ledgers, the filings, the official stamps that transformed mere words into undeniable truth. They understood that paper properly executed held a power even greater than the Baron's wealth or his son's cruelty. When Henri had taken them into town in early March, supposedly to file the document that officially registered them as property of the Devo family. A grotesque, illegal act, yet one that went unchallenged in St. Helena Parish in 1874. Cora had seized her opportunity. While Henri, distracted and arrogant, spoke with the clerk, Cora, with a supernatural calm, had slipped away. She had found the records room, a dusty, dimly lit chamber filled with towering shelves of ledgers. Her eyes, trained by countless hours of secret reading, quickly located the specific ledger where the document was to be filed, and with a heart pounding like a trapped bird, She had stolen a blank page, a pristine sheet of official paper, its edges crisp, its surface weighty. End for words. It was that page, folded small and tucked into the sleeve of her dress, a tiny, fragile seed of hope that the twins now carried. It was their weapon, their shield, their only chance. They had endured the past 3 months not out of giving in, but out of a desperate, calculated patience, waiting for the exact moment to strike. Their silence was not brokenness, but a deep, terrifying strength. March 19, 1874, was a Thursday, a day that began like any other, but would end in a huge shift. The weather had turned clearly warm, the first real lazy warmth of spring, a welcome relief from the biting cold of winter. The air, thick with humidity, smelled of wet earth, of growing life, of the sweet, intoxicating scent of jasmine beginning to bloom. The workers in the quarters, their bodies tired, but their spirits lifted by the promise of easier days, finished their day's labor in the fields, their hoes and shovels clanking softly, and returned to their cabins, grateful for the longer daylight hours. At the main house, the routine of power and privilege continued. Lucien Deveau was in his study, a room heavy with the scent of old leather and cigar smoke, reviewing his ledgers by the soft glow of a single oil lamp, his brow wrinkled in concentration. Henri was in the parlor, sprawled in a velvet armchair, idly flipping through a week-old newspaper, his attention elsewhere. Julien, ever restless, was in the stables, the air thick with the smell of hay and horseflesh, drinking cheap whiskey from a flask and carefully cleaning his favorite rifle, its barrel gleaming ominously. The twins, Cora and Clara, were in their small, cold room, as they had been every night for 3 months. Their presence, a silent, almost forgotten fixture of the East Wing. At approximately 9, as the last traces of twilight faded into a moonless, star-dusted night, Delphine the cook was walking back to her cabin in the quarters. Her day was done, her feet aching, her mind already anticipating the brief rest of sleep. As she passed the main house, her gaze, habitually scanning for any sign of trouble or unusual activity, drifted towards the East Wing, and then she stopped, her breath catching in her throat, a sudden cold knot forming in her stomach. The East Wing window, the window of the twins' room, was open. This was deeply unusual. Delphine remembered clearly that the window had been nailed shut back in January, after Julien, in a fit of anger, had complained that the twins were staring out of it too much, their silent gazes unsettling him. Delphine herself had seen the nails, long and thick, driven deep into the wooden frame, securing it with an almost brutal ending. But now the window was clearly open, a dark rectangular void against the dimly lit wall, and the thin, grimy curtain was fluttering gently in the soft night breeze. A silent signal. Delphine stood frozen in the darkness, her heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs, watching, waiting. And then she saw movement. A shadow impossibly quick and low passed across the open window, and then another, a mirror image. The twins were climbing out. Delphine's first natural reaction was to cry out, to raise the alarm, to fulfill her unspoken duty to the Baron. But something stopped her, a powerful, almost basic force. Maybe it was the way the twins moved, silent, careful, purposeful, like creatures of the night. Maybe it was the memory of the sharp, splitting sounds she had heard coming from the carriage house weeks ago, sounds she had tried to forget. Maybe it was the simple, deep human understanding that some people, no matter their position, deserve to run, deserve a chance at escape. Or perhaps it was the chilling realization that their escape, however unlikely, was a silent act of justice. She said nothing. She simply turned, her movements slow and careful, and walked back to her cabin, her gaze fixed straight ahead, her ears straining for any sound from the house. She did not look back, not once, fearing that to do so might break the fragile spell, might betray the silent deal she had just made with her conscience. The twins dropped from the window onto the soft, damp ground below, landing with a practiced grace that spoke of careful preparation. They rolled, absorbing the impact, and came up running, their bare feet silent on the dew-dusted grass. They did not head for the main road, nor for the river, which offered a dangerous escape. Instead, they ran toward the quarters, a cluster of dark, silent cabins nestled at the edge of the Devo property. They moved through the darkness like wisps of smoke slipping between cabins, their forms barely visible against the deeper shadows. They avoided the few workers who were still outside, lingering by their cabin doors, enjoying the cool night air. They seemed to know exactly where they were going, their path sure, as if they had planned this moment, practiced it countless times in their minds, as if they had been waiting for this exact meeting of warmth, darkness, and opportunity. They stopped at a cabin near the very edge of the quarters, a small, humble structure that housed a woman named Iris and her 3 young children. Iris was a widow. Her husband, a quiet, hard-working man, had died 2 years before in a tragic accident involving a runaway plow and a spooked horse. She worked the fields from dawn till dusk, her back bent, her hands rough, and kept mostly to herself, her grief a silent companion. The other workers respected her for her quiet strength, her steady toughness in the face of constant hardship. The twins approached the cabin door, their hearts pounding, and knocked softly, a hesitant, almost invisible tap. Iris opened it, her face marked with tiredness, her eyes still heavy with sleep. She saw them standing there in the pale moonlight, 2 identical figures, their faces stark and serious, and she froze, a gasp catching in her throat. Her first thought was that they were ghosts, or perhaps a dream. "Please," one of the twins said, her voice a soft, hoarse whisper, barely audible above the chirping of crickets. It was the first word anyone had heard either of them speak in 3 months, a sound so fragile it seemed it might shatter. Her voice was rough, as if unused, a rusty hinge creaking open. "Please, we need help." Iris stared at them for a long, painful moment, her mind racing, trying to match the silent ghost-like figures she had seen with these 2 desperate speaking girls. The meaning of their presence on her doorstep were terrifying. Then slowly she stepped aside, her movements stiff, and let them in, closing the door softly behind them, plunging the small cabin into near darkness. Inside the cabin, by the flickering, uncertain light of a single tallow candle, the twin Cora and Clara finally told their story. Their voices, though still soft, gained strength as they spoke. The words flowing out, a dam breaking. They were not from Louisiana. They were from Virginia, from a small, plain town near Richmond, nestled among rolling hills and tobacco fields. Their mother had been a gifted seamstress, her nimble fingers capable of complex embroidery. Their father a strong, dependable blacksmith, his forge a constant source of warmth and light. They had lived a quiet life, a good life filled with the simple rhythms of work and family, until tragedy struck in the summer of 1872. Their parents had died in a sudden, devastating fire that ate their small home, leaving them orphaned and alone. The twins, who were barely 13 at the time, had no other family, no kin to take them in. They were taken in by a local church, its pastor promising to find them a safe home, a new beginning. Instead, the church, burdened by its own poverty and the overwhelming number of war orphans, had sold them. Not officially, of course, not legally, not with a bill of sale, but sold them nonetheless to a man who dealt in children, orphans, runaways, anyone who would not be missed, anyone whose absence would go unremarked. The man, a shadowy figure who moved between states, had taken them to New Orleans, a city teeming with both opportunity and desperation. There they were kept in a cramped, dirty house with other children, all of them waiting like livestock to be sold again, their futures hanging by a thread. In December of 1873, Lucien Deveau had come to that house. He had inspected the children with a cold, calculating gaze, his eyes empty of pity, the way one might inspect CT, a herd of cattle. And he had chosen the twins, their identical features and quiet manner, apparently appealing to his sense of collecting. He had paid in cash, a thick wad of bills, and had taken them away, their fate sealed. They had been at the Deveau estate for 3 months. 3 months of being locked in a small cold room, of being used, of being treated as things rather than people, their humanity systematically stripped away. They had endured it because they had no choice, no means of escape. But they had also been planning carefully, patiently, their minds working in the shadows, because the twins had a secret, a weapon more powerful than any physical force. They could read and they could write. Their mother had taught them back in Virginia before the fire, putting in them a love for knowledge that went beyond their circumstances. And in the Deveau house, in the dusty, forgotten library, they had found books, old books, forgotten books, books that no one thought to lock away, for who would care about such things? They had read them in secret late at night by the faint, stolen light of a candle or the pale glow of the moon. And they had learned things. They had learned about the law, about the complex dance of contracts and property, about the loopholes that existed in the chaotic aftermath of Reconstruction. They understood that while the spirit of the law might be ignored, the letter of the law, if properly used, still held power, and they had learned about the courthouse in Greensburg, about the power of official documents of signatures and stamps. When Henri had taken them into town in early March, supposedly to file the document that would legally bind them to the Deveau family, Cora had acted. While Henri, absorbed in his own self-importance, spoke with the clerk, Cora, with a heart hammering against her ribs, had slipped away. She had found the records room, a maze of shelves and dusty ledgers, and with a flash of insight, she had located the specific ledger where their fate was to be recorded, and she had stolen a blank page, a pristine official sheet of paper waiting to be filled with words of freedom. It was that page, folded small and tucked into Cora's sleeve, that the twins now showed to Iris. It was their declaration, their desperate plea. "We can write our own document," Cora said, her voice gaining a quiet conviction. "We can say we were freed. We can say we have the right to leave, but we need a witness, someone who will sign it, someone who will say it is true, someone who will stand with us." Iris looked at the blank paper, then at the twins, their faces earnest and determined in the candlelight, then back at the paper. The weight of their request settled upon her, heavy and terrifying. "If I sign this," she said slowly, her voice barely a whisper, "and they find out, they will kill me. They will kill my children." The fear was raw, touchable. "If you do not sign it," the other twin Clara said quietly, her voice steady, "they will kill us. And they will continue to do what they do. Nothing will change." Iris was silent for a long, painful time. Outside the night was still and warm, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a lonely sound in the vast darkness. The candle flickered, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, making the twins' faces seem both heavenly and determined. She thought of her own children, sleeping soundly in the next room, and the fragility of their existence. She thought of the wrongs she had witnessed, the quiet suffering of her community, and she thought of the courage these two young girls, barely more than children themselves, possessed. Finally, with a deep shaking breath, Iris reached for the pen, its nib scratching faintly against the rough paper of the table. Her hand trembled, but her resolve, once found, was firm. Iris signed the document in the early hours of March 20th, just before the first faint blush of dawn touched the eastern sky. Her hand shook visibly as she wrote her name. The simple, elegant script, a proof of her own quiet education, but her signature, once completed, was clear and readable, a defiant mark against the Baron's power. The twins, their faces alive with a fragile hope, thanked her with a deep, silent gratitude. They folded the precious paper carefully, and tucked it back into Cora's sleeve, a secret weapon hidden in plain sight. "What will you do now?" Iris asked, her voice still laced with a tremor of fear, but also with a growing sense of wonder. "We will leave," Clara said, her voice now filled with a quiet certainty. "Tonight, before they notice we are gone, before the sun fully rises and lights our absence." "And if they catch you?" Iris pressed, her gaze searching their faces. The thought of the Baron's punishment was a cold dread in her stomach. The twins looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them, a shared understanding forged in hardship. And for the first time, Iris saw something in their dark eyes that was not fear, not despair, but something colder, something harder, something totally firm. It was a glint of steel, a spark of defiance. "They will not catch us," Cora said, her voice flat, determined. But they did not leave that night, because before they could, before the first rays of the sun could fully pierce the darkness, something happened that changed everything, speeding up their carefully laid plans into a desperate, immediate gamble. At approximately 6 in the morning, as the first roosters began to crow, Julian Devo, restless and bored even in the early hours, decided to make his way to the east wing to check on the twins. He found the door locked as always, a symbol of his control, but when he unlocked it and pushed it open, the small room was empty. The narrow bed was undisturbed, the single chair vacant. The window, which he himself had ordered nailed shut, was open, the thin, grimy curtain fluttering gently in the gentle morning breeze, a silent, mocking banner of escape. Julian's face, usually flushed with drink or anger, went stark white. A cold, basic fear, unfamiliar and unwelcome, gripped him. He ran downstairs, his heavy boots pounding on the polished wood, shouting for his father, for his brother, for anyone who could hear him, his voice raw with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Within minutes, the entire Devo estate was plunged into chaos. The quiet morning, usually reserved for the slow, careful preparations for the day's work, was shattered by shouts and frantic activity. Lucien Devo, woken from his sleep, his face a mask of fury, ordered an immediate, complete search. Every cabin in the quarters was to be inspected, every corner turned inside out, every worker was to be questionné, their answers examined for any hint of helping. The twins were to be found, and they were to be brought back, no matter the cost, no matter what it took. His authority, his very image of control, had been challenged, and that was an unforgivable offense. Henri, ever the dutiful, if cruel son, took a group of armed men and began systematically searching the vast fields, his eyes narrowed, his rifle held ready. Julian, his face still pale with shock and rage, took another group and searched the dense woods along the river, his movements erratic, his temper simmering. Lucien himself, his silver hair disheveled, his eyes blazing, went directly to the quarters. Moving from cabin to cabin, his presence a terrifying storm, demanding answers, his voice booming with barely contained anger. The workers, woken from their sleep, stood silently, their faces blank, their eyes carefully empty. They had seen nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing. Their group ignorance was a shield, a silent act of resistance. Lucien's face grew darker with each denial, each blank stare. But he did not push them. Not yet. He knew the futility of brute force against a wall of silence, but his patience was wearing thin. By midday the search had expanded beyond the Devo property, spreading outwards like ripples in a pond. Riders were sent to neighboring plantations, to the small town of Greensburg, to the bustling river docks. A detailed description of the twins was passed around. Identical girls, 14 or 15 years old, light brown skin, dark hair braided tightly, wearing plain gray dresses, but no one had seen them. The delta, vast and unforgiving, seemed to have swallowed them whole. By evening, as the sun died below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows, Lucien Deveau was beyond furious. He gathered his sons in his study, the air thick with tension, and slammed the heavy oak door shut. The workers standing outside in the yard, their ears straining, could hear his voice, a low, guttural roar, though they could not make out the specific words. The sound was enough. It spoke of a man pushed to the edge. And then, just after sunset, as the first stars began to prick the darkening sky, something happened that no one, not even Lucien Deveau, in his wildest imaginings expected. The twins walked out of the quarters. They walked calmly, carefully, side by side, their hands folded neatly in front of them, their faces calm, almost peaceful. They walked across the dusty yard, past the stables where the horses whinnied nervously, past the old carriage house, and stopped directly in front of the main house, their small figures outlined against the lamplit porch. Their return was not a surrender, but a calculated, bold challenge. Lucien Deveau, who had been pacing the porch like a caged tiger, stopped dead, staring at them in total disbelief. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, no words coming out. "Where have you been?" he finally demanded, his voice with a mixture of rage and shock. The question was less about their physical location, and more about the boldness of their return. Cora, her movements slow and careful, reached into her sleeve and pulled out the folded document. It was the blank page now filled with precise, elegant script signed and witnessed. She held it up, extending it towards Lucien so that he could see it clearly in the fading light. "We have been freed," she said, her voice calm, steady, without a trace of fear. A stark contrast to the trembling whisper Iris had heard hours earlier. "This document says so. It is signed and witnessed. We are no longer your property. Baron Deveau." Lucien walked down the steps slowly, his eyes fixed on the paper, his mind struggling to understand what he was seeing, what he was hearing. He took the document from Cora's outstretched hand, his fingers brushing hers, and unfolded it with a jerky, almost violent motion. His eyes scanned the words, his brow deepening with each line. For a long, painful moment he said nothing, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant croaking of frogs from the bayou. Then a sound escaped his lips. It began as a low chuckle, then grew into a harsh, bitter laugh empty of any genuine amusement. It was a cold, chilling sound, and it made the workers who were watching from the shadows of the quarters shiver, a group ripple of unease passing through them. "This," Lucien said, holding up the paper, his hand trembling slightly, "is forgery, a clumsy, pathetic forgery. Do you really think this will save you? Do you truly believe such a crude trick will stand against my word?" "It is not a forgery," Clara said, her voice equally calm, equally determined. "It is a legal document. It was filed in the courthouse in Greensburg. It is on record. It is official." Lucien's mocking smile vanished. replaced by a look of stunned disbelief, then dawning horror. "What?" he whispered, the single word sharp disbelieving. "We filed it this morning," Cora explained, her voice precise, almost teaching. "Before you woke up, before you knew we were gone. It is in the ledger now. It is official. It is the law." Lucien's face, which had been pale with shock, now flushed a deep, angry red. He crumpled the paper in his fist, crushing the words of freedom, and took a threatening step toward the twins, his eyes blazing with a dangerous fury. "You think you are clever?" he snarled, his voice low and dangerous, a predator's growl. "You think you can outsmart me, a Devo? But you are wrong. I will go to that courthouse, and I will have that document removed. I will have it burned, erased from existence, and then I will bring you back here, and I will make sure you never try this again. I will break you." "You cannot remove it," Cora said, her voice firm, her gaze meeting his with an unnerving directness. "Because it is not the only copy." Lucien froze, his threatening stride halted mid-step. The air crackled with a sudden, deep tension. "We made 3 copies," Clara explained, her voice a soft, chilling echo of her sister's. "One is in the courthouse, officially filed. One is with a witness who will testify on our behalf, a person of good standing in this community, and one is hidden where you will never find it, a safeguard. If anything happens to us, if we disappear, if we are harmed, all 3 copies will be made public, and everyone will know what you did. Everyone will know that you bought us. Everyone will know that you kept us as slaves 9 years after slavery was ended. Your name, Baron Devo, will be the same as shame." Lucien stared at them, his jaw working, a muscle twitching violently in his cheek. His hands, still clenched into fists, trembled with held-back rage. The boldness, the sheer unimaginable defiance of these 2 girls was a blow to his very core. "Who is the witness?" he demanded, his voice barely a whisper laced with a desperate, chilling threat. The twins said nothing, their silence now a powerful weapon. "Who is the witness?" Lucien roared, his voice echoing across the silent yard, shattering the fragile peace of the evening. And then, from the shadows of the quarters, a voice spoke. It was a woman's voice, trembling slightly, but clear and determined, cutting through the tension like a knife. "I am." Iris stepped forward out of the deep shadows cast by the cabins into the pale lamplight spilling from the main house. Her figure was small, but her presence in that moment was huge. She was trembling, yes, but her gaze fixed on Lucien Devo was steady, firm. "I signed the document," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I am the witness, and I will testify to its truth." Lucien turned to her, his eyes blazing with a renewed, terrifying fury. For a moment the workers watching from the quarters thought he might strike her, might unleash his full, wild anger upon this brave, defiant woman. But he did not. Instead, a slow, chilling smile spread across his face, that same cold, bitter smile that had sent shivers down Tobias Holt's spine. "Then you will hang with them," he said, his voice a low, poisonous promise. "All of you, you will all pay for this insolence. What happened next is a matter of public record, though the records themselves, as is often the case in such changing times, are incomplete, broken, and purposely hidden. The official stories often leave out the inconvenient truths, the uncomfortable details that challenge the established order. On the crisp, cool morning of March 21st, 1874, the air still carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint promise of spring, Lucien Devo rode into Greensburg. He was not alone. His sons, Henri and Julien, rode beside him, their faces grim, their expressions a mixture of anger and worry. Behind them, 3 armed men, hardened overseers from the Devo estate, rode with rifles across their saddles, their presence a clear, unspoken threat. The small group moved with a grim determination, kicking up dust on the main street, drawing the tired glances of the few townspeople already stirring. Lucien went directly to the courthouse, its brick front looking particularly imposing in the morning light. He strode inside, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden floor, his presence filling the quiet space with an almost touchable threat. He demanded to see the ledger where property documents were filed, his voice booming, echoing off the high ceilings. The clerk, a nervous young man named Thomas Whitley, barely out of his teens, his spectacles perched dangerously on his nose, came out from a back office. His hands trembled slightly as he retrieved the massive leather-bound ledger from its shelf, its pages thick with the history of land and ownership in St. Helena Parish. He placed it on the counter, its weight thudding softly, and opened it to the most recent entries, his eyes darting nervously between the Baron and the open page. There, dated March 20th, 1874, in clear, precise script, was a document. It stated clearly that 2 girls, Cora and Clara, formerly held by Lucien Devo, had been legally freed and were no longer subject to any claim of ownership, their freedom now written in the very records that had Ankh sought to bind them. The document was signed by Iris, listed clearly as a witness, her signature clear and determined, and importantly, it was countersigned by a justice of the peace named Albert Finch, his official stamp, lending it undeniable legal weight. Lucien's eyes, narrowed to slits, devoured the words. His face, already flushed with anger, deepened to a dangerous purple. He slammed his fist on the counter, making Whitley jump. He demanded to see Finch, his voice a low growl. The clerk, stammering, explained that Finch had left town that very morning, heading north to Baton Rouge on urgent family business, and would not return for several days, a convenient or perhaps wise absence. Lucien then demanded that the document be immediately removed, torn from the ledger, erased from existence. Whitley, his face pale, shook his head. He explained, his voice barely a whisper, that he did not have the power to remove a legally filed document without a court order, a judge's clear command. The ledger, once an entry was made, was sacred. Lucien, his patience totally gone, slammed his fist on the desk again, the sound echoing through the quiet courthouse. He told the terrified clerk that he would have the document removed one way or another, with or without his cooperation. His eyes, burning with a cold fury, promised dire consequences, and then he left, his heavy footsteps thudding ominously, his sons and armed men following in his wake. But he did not go back to the estate. Instead, his rage still simmering, he went directly to the sheriff's office, a small, plain building across the dusty square. The sheriff of St. Helena Parish in 1874 was a man named Cyrus Tate. He was in his late 50s, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard living and difficult choices. A former Confederate officer, he had returned home after the war to find his world, his entire way of life turned upside down. He did not like Reconstruction, did not like the new federal laws, did not like the idea that people he had once considered property were now legally his equals. He harbored a deep-seated anger for the changes sweeping the South. But he was also a practical man, a realist who understood the shifting tides of power. He knew that